Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. We first of all have minutes of our meetings held on Wednesday, June 26, 2024, Wednesday, July 31st, 2024, and Wednesday, August 21st, 2024, to be confirmed. Senator Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move the confirmation of the following minutes, the minutes of our meetings held on Wednesday, the 26th of June, Wednesday, the 31st of July, and August, the 21st, all in 2024.
The question is that the minutes of our meetings held on June 26th, July 31st, and August 21st, 2024 be confirmed. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. With the ayes have it, those minutes stand confirmed. By way of further announcements, I have in the excuses for absence from our meeting today from the Senator, the Most Honorable Dr. Walcott, her Honor Senator Thompson, both of whom are away on national duty. Senator Mr. Maynard, who will be absent today, and Senator Crystal Drakes has indicated that she'll be late. Oh, and Senator Kevin Boyce will be absent today.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following documents today: the annual report of the Dighton Griffith Secondary School for the year September 1, 2020 to August 31st, 2021. And secondly, the audit financial statements of the Barbados Accreditation Council for the financial years ended March 31st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021, and for March 31st, 2022.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate, moved by minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 22-1 and 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that standing orders 22-1 and 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Standing orders 22-1 and 45-2 and therefore suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I want to join you in welcoming our newest member of the Senate, the Honorable, Senator Mr. Andre Worrell. I do understand that you have been here before, and so I have every confidence that your tenure here will add to the rich and robust debate that takes place in this honorable chamber, and that it will comply with all of the regular expected parliamentary procedures that we have all become accustomed to. So welcome once again. Mr. President, today I stand, first of all, to beg the first reading of the Electricity Supply Bill 2024.
Withdraw. Yeah.
The question is that the Electricity Supply Bill 2024.
Mr. President, the bill that is before the Honourable Chamber is to be withdrawn and to replace. Honourable members are in possession of the new bill, which is to be substituted. And so I beg to move that this current bill be withdrawn and replaced with the one which was circulated.
The question is that the previously circulated draft of the electricity supply bill be withdrawn and replaced with the subsequently circulated bill. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Within the ayes have it. The bill is accordingly withdrawn and so substituted. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I rise today to introduce.
First reading, please. First reading.
Mr. President, I rise today to beg the first reading of the electricity supply bill as withdrawn and replaced.
The question is that the electricity supply bill be read a first time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Within the ayes have it. This bill is accordingly read a first time. Senator Cummins.
We don't have to. Right. Mr. President, public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 6.
Order number 6.
In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Electricity Supply Bill 2024.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, the bill before the Honorable Senate is a detailed and an extensive bill. The colleagues are in possession of the bill, which is our order number 6, and I intend during the course of my presentation today to take the time to ensure that colleagues have a full update on not only the process by which this bill has been brought before this honorable chamber, but also, Mr. President, the substance of the bill. I start, first of all, Mr. President, with the process by which this bill has now reached this honorable chamber. Mr. President, somewhere back in 2019, when it was made clear that the existing regime under the Electric Light and Power Act and where the democratized and liberalized energy sector was evolving needed to be aligned, the journey of this bill began. This bill, Mr. President, was initially drafted for the first time in 2019, and then, Mr. President, from that far back, consultations were held with the primary stakeholders in the energy sector and broad stakeholders in the energy sector. 2019, Mr. President, at that time, we had stakeholders which included the Fair Trading Commission, the Government Electrical and Engineering Department, the Ministry of Energy, of course, anchored the process, the Electric Light and Power Committee, and the list continued. On the basis of those 2019 consultations which started, a bill itself then began to evolve by 2020. And in 2020 then, Mr. President, the draft bill was then submitted to the Chief Parliamentary Council, who, as we all know, is responsible for the legislative drafting of government's bills. In 2020 then, and by 2020, Mr. President, and with great detailed work undertaken, the legislative part of the drafting began. Mr. President, by 2022, in November, the bill then was being prepared for submission for the first time, starting in 2019, to the Cabinet of Barbados. Mr. President, I recall, I believe we were on the way to the late Sir Lloyd Standiford, his funeral. We were on our way to St. Peter Parish Church. And I recall, Mr. President, as the minister with responsibility for this bill, being on a call all the way from the pickup point where all of us assembled, all the way to St. Peter Parish Church, dressed for a funeral and with my pods in my ear, going through this bill in draft, line by line, section by section, until I arrived at the church. That was on the day of the funeral of the late Sir Lloyd Standiford. This is how long this goes back. That call, Mr. President, included persons, including the Chief Parliamentary Council and several others. Once that bill was finalized coming out of that process, Mr. President, I had to leave that consultation with my pods in my ear because it was taking place online, and I went to the funeral while the consultation continued, line by line, section by section. The bill then went, Mr. President, to the Cabinet. The cabinet then approved the bill, issued drafting instructions, issued instructions to the Chief Parliamentary Counsel then to take the bill and to ready it for public consultation. That was in November of 2022, Mr. President. That process continued, Mr. President. Once the bill came back to the ministry, the bill was put out for public consultation. That public consultation, Mr. President, continued until February of 2023, where on the platform of the Ministry of Energy and Business's website, via the Government Information Service on all of their platforms, via public notices in the newspaper inviting public consultation on the bill and inviting persons to submit comments on the bill, every member of this country who asserts that they have an interest in the electricity sector had an opportunity between 2019 and 2023, if they so desired, to comment on this bill. But that was at February 2023, Mr. President. We then, come February 2023, took all of the comments that we received from all of the stakeholders, Ms. Bradford on the Pike Corner bus, to the association, Mr. President, who has a vested interest in Barbados Renewable Energy Association, they all submitted comments. The Fair Trading Commission submitted comments. We then went through the arduous task, Mr. President, and I want to commend the officers of the Ministry of Energy, because drafting is no small thing. And drafting, when having a consultative process as wide as I have described, is definitely no small thing. So, Mr. President, the team at the Ministry of Energy, and we had a consultant who was hired to work with the ministry, then took all of the comments of all of those who had an interest in the energy sector and being consultative in the energy sector. They then codified all or collated all of those comments into a detailed matrix. That detailed matrix, Mr. President, led to us having a consultation in person at the Lloyd Erskine Sandiford Center, where the public and those persons who had submitted comments were invited to attend. They attended that meeting in their numbers, Mr. President. We used one of the large meeting rooms in LESC because the number of persons who confirmed their participation was so significant. And they came, Mr. President, and submitted their further views on the consolidated text. They had the opportunity, Mr. President, to interrogate submissions that had been made by other parties that they may or may not have agreed with. They had the opportunity to make further revisions to their additional submissions. They had the opportunity, Mr. President, to say, I agree here, but I would prefer something else to go there. It was an exhaustive process, Mr. President. When we were finished with that, Mr. President, come March of 2024, we were not satisfied still that we had made sure that everybody's views had been incorporated. This is a government of consultation, Mr. President, and this bill is perhaps one of the most recent representations of what consultation and engagement with the public looks like. Not just talked about, looks like, Mr. President. So what did we do? We then, Mr. President, between March and September, as recently as last week, not only did we send the draft revised bill back out to the same stakeholders and invite them to comment again, we then included our international partners, who this honorable chamber has heard me speak about on more than one occasion, to come to give their comments. These are people who have worked with the Rockefeller Fund on energy sectors all across the globe. They're not just local or even regional experts, they're international best practice experts. The Global Alliance for Energy People and Planet, they had an opportunity to comment. The Renewable Energy Laboratory Project, RELP, which is a department of the National Regulatory Authority of the Energy Ministry, or what would be the equivalent of the Energy Ministry of the US government. We had the Regulatory Assistance Project coming on board as well. They then added to the local comments among all the stakeholders and gave their further views on where they thought Barbados should position itself given the size of our market and where the global energy industry was going. So we then had local and global expertise. But we didn't stop there, Mr. President. We also then engaged through the person who we brought on last, Sir David Simmons, and I want to commend him, who is the chairman of the Law Reform Commission. He then came on board, Mr. President, with this process. He took everything that I have just described and everything we collated, and he, with his vast experience in the law and in drafting and in managing legal sectors, took the opportunity to engage further with his colleagues across the region. He had the opportunity, Mr. President, to engage with his counterparts and his colleagues in Jamaica and in other jurisdictions, and he wrote several legal briefs for us on elements of the brief. I learned things like the Carltona principle that I did not know existed before from Sir David Simmons. He then took the opportunity, Mr. President, not just to write the legal briefs, but to meet with the technical teams and the legal consultants to go over the draft and to meet with the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, Mr. President. This was no fly-by-night development of any bill, and it most certainly has not been snuck here. Mr. President, when we were finished doing that, we took the opportunity thereafter, Mr. President, to have a further collation of the bill, further revisions of the bill under the very careful and skilled guidance of Sir David Simmons, who is not a lawyer of any kind of questionable repute, even slightly. His skill and his competence and his reputation are unquestionable. He is a luminary in every possible way, as I am being reminded. So he has not exalted himself. He has been exalted by others and recognized by others the world over. And we brought him in to ensure that we had his guidance along with all of the inputs that we have received from the partners. Mr. President, last week, as recently as Wednesday night last week, somewhere around 10:30 in the night, I was still in the office with my team, and we were going through the final revisions of this bill. The Fair Trading Commission, Mr. President, submitted comments as recently as 10:30 on Wednesday last week on the draft of the bill. The Barbados Renewable Energy Association and all of the stakeholders, I was very pleased also, Mr. President, that even at that hour of the night, persons from the GEED, Government Engineering Electrical Department, picked up the phone and answered clarifying questions on the operationalization of this bill. This was not brought here in any rush. It wasn't brought here without the broadest of consultations and with the most expert of opinions having the opportunity to weigh in, Mr. President. I have taken the time to go through the process to ensure that this honorable chamber and the public understands that this bill, starting in 2019, made public in 2020, open for consultation throughout 2022 and 2023, finalized in 2023, and then sent back out for further consultations, has not come here by accident. On the government's legislative calendar, I also want to make it clear that this bill was always on the government's legislative agenda for ministries for debate in September. And so the timeline that we worked with all these months was September of 2024. It was always meant to be done in this month, Mr. President. But it has been delayed, Mr. President, not by anything other than the fact that consultations, engagement, and input from our stakeholders matter. And so even on Wednesday, with the eve of the submission of this bill to Cabinet on the Thursday, we were still open to receiving inputs. And Mr. President, here is what is also true. The Barbados Renewable Energy Association, representing large, small, individual entities, they wanted to have the opportunity still to look at the bill. We sent the bill to them. We proactively sent the bill to them. They were not able to comment in any great detail in time. But you know what we said to them, Mr. President? That a bill on the energy sector or any legislation in the energy sector, because the sector is so fast moving, because technology is so aggressive and is moving so quickly, the inevitability, Mr. President, of us having to revisit things over time is extremely high. And so what we have agreed as a ministry is to the creation of a regulatory sandbox for legislation on energy, where all of the pieces of legislation on energy can reside, and they're open for inputs, reform, and amendment, in particular, over the coming years, because the sector has evolved so significantly. So, Mr. President, I wanted to start there so that it is clear that from the government, from the public, from the associations in the energy sector, from the utility, from the regulator, from every entity. Mr. President, we even had, I want to list some of the entities that have commented on this draft bill, Mr. President. The Fair Trading Commission, the Barbados Light and Power Company, the Government Electrical Engineering Department, the Ministry of Transport Works and Maintenance, and you will see as I go through the bill why that is important. The Ministry of Environment and Natural Beautification, you will also see why that is important when I begin going through the bill. We have spoken about BREA, the Barbados Renewable Energy Agent Association, the Barbados National Oil Company, Barbados National Terminal Company, Planning and Development Department, you will see references in the draft legislation to that. The Electric Light and Power Committee, which is empowered under this legislation and under the ELPA to issue licenses. The Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, BADMC, BAMC, Water Authority, the Ministry of Finance, the University of the West Indies, Mr. President, the National Standards Institution, Barbados Association of Retired Persons, they have sat as an intervener and they took the opportunity to submit, Mr. President, their comments. Everyone else had an opportunity to do the same. RUBIS, the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers, the Barbados Cooperatives League, the Bioenergy Group, the Transport Board, the Airport, the Seaport, the Division of Information, the Ministry of Education, the Alliance of Public Transport, the Alliance of Public Transport Operators, Sanitation Service Authority, the Barbados Community College. Mr. President, I think that I have listed a wide enough cross-section of stakeholders that will suggest to you that even if that is not exhausted, and it is not, from Williams Capital, all of the players, large, small, government, private, have had an opportunity, and I want to use this opportunity to thank them for engaging with us in a meaningful and in a constructive way to be able to make the necessary changes to a piece of legislation that will affect us all. Now, I want to come, Mr. President, to the legislation itself. And I hope that in my exhaustive detailing of what the consultation process was leading to this, I have made it clear that we are a government of consultation in name and in action. We are a government of engagement in name and in action. Now, in this legislation, Mr. President, we have two primary objectives, The two primary objectives, well, several primary objectives actually, but first of all, it is to create a new framework for the electricity sector. Mr. President, it is no secret to anyone that the electricity sector, as it was originally in the early 19th century, which is where the original Electric Light and Power Act originated, in the early 19th century, that the electricity sector then is not the electricity sector now. It is clear, Mr. President, that where we are, while we may have, and we are a small market, so let us not fool ourselves, we are a small market, and so the option of having like much bigger economies, multiple players in the electricity space is not a likelihood. Across the Caribbean region, in in every instance, you have a single utility. Every single Caribbean country, because of size and scale, they have a single utility. Barbados is no different. So there has to be a discussion around how to manage a single utility as a monopoly service provider while liberalizing the sector to make sure that there is democratization of access for all, for people. So this legislation attempts to find that balance. It also attempts, Mr. President, to treat to the historical legislation that exists that needed to be brought into alignment. The ministry has the role of market monitor for the energy sector. The Fair Trading Commission, governed by the Fair Trading Commission Act and with responsibility for administering the Utilities Regulation Act, has the responsibility of the regulator, ensuring fair competition, ensuring that they protect the rights of the consumer, ensuring that they also provide for an enabling environment to ensure that investments by the monopoly utility are managed in a way that it balances both the cost effectiveness of that investment, the return on investment by the entity, and simultaneously protecting consumers. Those are the remits of the Fair Trading Commission. But the ministry is market monitor. And so these various agencies have been functioning all of this time in a very largely incoherent way. There has not been historically the kind of collaboration that has been needed on a policy level among the agencies. This bill seeks to do that. You will see, Mr. President, throughout the legislation, the balancing of the ministry as market monitor, where policy for the country is set, and policy as derived by the kind of consultative process that I have just described is how we arrive at an end point. We are still implementing of 2019, the Barbados National Energy Policy, so that is a framing policy that guides what the ministry does, but the regulator, the commission, they focus on the regulatory management, and you, Mr. President, would know the role of the FTC having sat in a chair before. Mr. President, the first section of this bill then speaks to the overall umbrella objective, system planning. This did not exist in the original Electric Light and Power Act. System planning requires now, for the first time, the development of mechanisms in a coherent, policy-driven way, as I have just outlined, of a number of things. One, an integrated resource and resilience plan. So it looks here under 5.1a in the legislation on the system planning. It says develop integrated resources and resilience and grid modernization plans for the system. So those are not small things, Mr. President. In the case of the integrated resource and resilience plan, the last integrated resource and resilience plan, Mr. President, was done in 2021. The one before that was done in 2019. This is what I'm talking about when I say that transformation happens quickly in the energy sector, and so you will continuously have to have that regulatory sandbox where you are continuously updating. The most recent Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan, Mr. President, is a 2024 instrument. It is currently now, Mr. President, in between the time that we launched it in August 2023 and completed it in early 2024 with the consultants, Mott MacDonald, who had been brought in to do this process and have done it several times before, things had changed. And so we, rather than publish a document that potentially could have been dated, went back to make further amendments, and we are now awaiting the 2024 edition of the Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan. Today is the 27th of September, Mr. President, and as at the 25th of September, the most recent grid modernization plan went out for public consultation. Again, public consultation. The grid modernization plan, which is a requirement of the utility, was drafted, completed, shared with the ministry, but before being shared with the ministry, it had to go to GEED. Once it came back from GEED, the ministry weighed in, but then it had to go to the regulator, as most things do, and it went to the Fair Trading Commission. The Fair Trading Commission, which has the role of the public interlocutor, where the public consultation is legally required, the public consultation then started, and for a period of 3 weeks, Mr. President, the Fair Trading Commission opened the grid code to public consultation and submissions. That deadline ended on the 25th of September, and now the team at the technical team at the Fair Trading Commission will take those comments on board, and then the final grid code will evolve as a result of that process. But what this legislation does, and I'm not going to spend much time on this part of it beyond here, but it will be to make sure that the kind of policy coherence that I just spoke about is done in every single instance for all system planning. So what the legislation introduces in this section, Mr. President, is that these things must be developed in consultation with the Commission, which is the Fair Trading Commission, the Chief Electrical Officer, which is the GEED, the System Operator, and the Ministry. So it broadens the scope and makes sure in the legislation that all agencies are in tandem and working towards the same thing, Mr. President. Equally, it requires consultation with those same entities that I spoke about on any matter concerning the electricity sector and on matters concerning the system. It also speaks about system forecasting as directed by the minister. Now, this is an important part of the conversation, Mr. President. We come to work every day. We don't sit on the outside of the system, we sit on the inside of the system. So some of these things we're not guessing at. And sometimes there are persons who think that because they sit on the outside or they may have a couple of conversations that they become the experts on the process. Mr. President, the system planning that we're talking about here, the Ministry of Energy did not and has not for its history had an electricity planning unit. It has not. The Ministry of Public Service has approved the creation of an electricity planning unit, and recruitment is underway now to populate that division. That division internal to the Ministry of Energy is to support exactly what we have here, system planning. It is meant to work in tandem, Mr. President, with an expanded role of the Fair Trading Commission, which is in the process as we speak of recruiting, with support from one of our development partners, a grid modeler, because they, together with the ministry and together with the utility, are working on the process of ensuring that they can implement the provisions of Section 5 of this legislation for system planning. Now, the utility has been extraordinarily cooperative in providing information as requested. Every Friday, I did not have the meeting this morning because I was here, but also because I was in another meeting. Every single Friday, we have, I guess I could call it system planning meetings, but we're specifically dealing with one issue, and we meet every single Friday. And in those meetings, Mr. President, every week, we have the entire Ministry Energy core team, the leadership of the ministry. I chair the meeting as well. We have our international partners, we have the Fair Trading Commission, and we have the utility. We have a data room. We have non-disclosure agreements which have been signed. And in the data room, the utility shares all of the information required by the ministry to engage in system planning, and they have shared all of the information required by the Fair Trading Commission. That is not public information. That is subject to non-disclosure information. They probably will not share that by anybody who just picks up the phone and calls them and asks them. But there is a data room governed by a non-disclosure agreement which exists. And so every piece of information is in there for the purpose of implementing system planning. Then, Mr. President, this is important, the introduction of microgrids. This was not there in the original legislation, but it is critical. It is part of the liberalization of the sector. And so the idea, Mr. President, of including smart grid infrastructure, as my colleague, Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight would know, smart grid infrastructure for electricity is almost the equivalent as we have done it, and we've seen it done in the past for water. Barbados Water Authority having to have smart grid infrastructure, the same thing applies to the utility. Equally, the underground placement of electric lines, and I think we spoke about that recently. The notion, Mr. President, that a Prime Minister who addressed the United Nations this morning and in her address spoke about issues relating to resilience, who addressed the Rockefeller Foundation yesterday with the President Raj and had conversations around what countries like ours need, who launched yesterday version 3.0 of the Bridgetown Initiative, Mr. President, and has been talking therefore about resilience. The question of underground placement of power lines, electric lines, is a critical part of the conversation. If a climate event hits this country and our power line system and infrastructure comes down, Mr. President, then the ability for us to recover our electrical infrastructure quickly has been severely hampered. And so the legislation, as is the reflection of the policy of the government, speaks about underground placement of electricity lines. It also speaks, Mr. President, moving on to section 6.1, about the process of engaging, again, consultation. The language is throughout the legislation. Targets for electricity supply this time now from sources of renewable energy. You have to integrate, Mr. President, the commission, again, the chief electrical officer, the utility, and the system operator. Any other persons as may be deemed appropriate, because we want to make sure that it is wide. Equally, Mr. President, I then want to bring attention further to the question of the Advisory Committee. At Section 8.1, this is a mirror almost, but not in its entirety, of the Advisory Committee that we know as the LPAC, which has been established under the ELPA. The ELPA, Mr. President, did establish an advisory committee, but the advisory committee, Mr. President, here, and you will see it in the first schedule, and how it has been expanded, and then Section 8.1.4, you will see it here, Mr. President, where the functions of the committee are as they are. But then if you were to go to the first schedule, we have integrated that not just the role of the committee to focus on advising the minister on matters especially relating to licenses, but to ensure that, one, the committee is populated by experts in their disciplines who understand the energy sector specifically, but then secondly, Mr. President, that the committee has the opportunity in its own right, before advising the minister, whoever that minister is, to consult with anybody who it deems to be an expert in a given area. This is captured in the first schedule relating to Section 8 of the legislation. So the idea here, Mr. President, is that yes, we know people sit on boards, people sit on committees, and they may counsel themselves a lot of times because they're experts. But we wanted to make sure that sometimes, especially where technology is fast evolving, Mr. President, when the 2021 Integrated Resource Resilience Plan was done, they had no hydrogen projects in there, Mr. President, not one. In 2019, it wasn't even a thought. But in 2023, we have one. And so the 2023-2024 Integrated Resource Resilience Plan, by definition, looks different to the one that was just 2 years before. So the notion, Mr. President, that a committee can remain static and not consult on issues that are in the expertise of persons who may have come into the space subsequent to their appointment is a notion that we do not subscribe to. And we have made way for experts in specific disciplines, whoever they may be, to be able to engage either proactively or reactively with the ELPA committee. That has been a new innovation that we have put here, Mr. President. Restrictions on certain electricity services without licenses. But Mr. President, this is not, I don't think, magic. You can go and set up electricity without a license easily. Electricity is not water. Electricity burns. Electricity is a safety concern. It has specific considerations that require it to be managed using certain standards. And so Section 9 speaks about what those standards are, and it requires those persons to have licensable activities covered there. The process of applying for a license is detailed at Section 10. The issuance of a license in the same way is also captured there, and you will see mention, and it will come up a little later under the Planning and Development Act. You will see the section of the legislation that also speaks about planning and development. But then, Mr. President, one of the things that is particularly new is in Section 12 and onward. Sometimes you will not always agree with the decisions that have been made by the technical officials, and one of the submissions that was made by one of the parties, I believe it was the legal counsels, they advised that it was important to incorporate the right to be heard. So that before you make a decision, there's one thing to have the right of appealing the decision as was there in the original legislation, but before you get to appellate action, there has to be the right to be heard. And we included the right to be heard throughout the legislation. First, the right to be heard, outlined the process of appealing if you were uncomfortable with the decision, incorporated the ability to make the changes as required, and then once the changes were made, then the decision could be stayed and it would not have to be taken. And that has been covered, Mr. President, in all of these elements. Mr. President, at Section 13, that is an important section. It speaks about local content. This is perhaps one of the most important elements of the legislation that is before us and is important to all of us. Mr. President, the section is decidedly broad, and I want to spend a moment on this. When we consulted with stakeholders and partners, there were a number of very prescriptive recommendations that were being made. Some people wanted to have a minimum threshold for investment. Some people wanted to have a guaranteed percentage of investment made available. And the decision there was, but local participation can come in multiple different ways. And we wanted to be able to replicate that properly. And so, Mr. President, we then drew on a body of work that the Commonwealth Secretariat did for us, and we want to express our appreciation to the Commonwealth Secretariat. They created a local content policy that helped to frame what we intend to put here. And so they introduced, Mr. President, as is seen in Section 13, the reference to a local content plan. Your project may look different to Ms. Jones from St. Lucie. Ms. Jones' project from St. Lucie may look different to Ms. Barrow project from St. Philip. And so we wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to frame their project within the confines of the specifics of their project to have the same outcome. So the work being done by the Commonwealth Secretariat, that was done by the Commonwealth Secretariat for us, will therefore be captured in the regulations that will be appended to this bill upon proclamation. Those regulations, Mr. President, will include the local content plan, which will cover a couple of things. The inclusion of the local content plans, Mr. President, will include measures that the Commonwealth has shared in their policy paper, such as the following. Individuals shall be given consideration in matters of employment and training and the provision of goods and service in the energy industry value chain. The minister may require that as a condition to receive training pursuant to the legislation, an individual, Barbadian individual, who is an employee of the government or any of its agencies be bonded to the state for a specific time. Barbadian companies shall be given consideration in the award of licenses, the supply of equipment, goods and services, and all other projects for which tenders and contracts are awarded in the energy industry value chain. But Mr. President, let us also be clear. We are not the innovators of the technology. We're not the manufacturers of the technology. A lot of these things may sound good. Let's buy it local. And in some instances, Mr. President, you may have to partner with a local entity, but you can't buy it in its entirety local. Where would I buy hydrogen? Locally. It doesn't exist. But you have local partners who have become investors in a hydrogen project, and collectively, with an international partner, they are able to launch a project. This is not an academic exercise. This is how it has actually been playing out in the market. Solar panels, Mr. President, are not produced in Barbados, but why should we not be producing solar panels in Barbados? And so there has been a discussion around not necessarily producing solar panels in Barbados, because you want to make sure that there's still economies of scale, but assembling solar panels in Barbados, which would then focus not just on Barbados's consumption requirements, but the regional consumption requirements. We also have, Mr. President, mechanisms like joint venture arrangements within a Barbadian company where you have percentage ownership of the company, and so on and so on and so on. So all of these are the kinds of elements that we expect to see incorporated, Mr. President, in Section 13 and the preparation of a local content plan, which is now a requirement under this legislation. The same principles of natural justice that I spoke about under the renewal of the license are all captured all the way through Section 14 through 16, suspension of a license, and so on. And it also requires you, Mr. President, which is an interesting one, at 17, for you to notify the market monitor of changes where the licensee is transferred. Now, this is drawn, Mr. President, from the Companies Act of Barbados. The Companies Act of Barbados recognizes the licensee at 17A, Mr. President, as a juridical person. So the company may be established, but it may have a beneficial owner or a uniquely beneficial owner as defined by the Companies Act. And so if that changes, Mr. President, there has to be the notification, because of course, there has to be the question of who is the responsible party. Same thing applies, Mr. President, to the assignment of a license. Now, Section 19.1 states right to step in. This is a section that also had the benefit of an extensive process of public consultation. And in fact, Sections 3 and 4 are insertions that came from many of the parties that agreed with those sections that they needed to be included. The state's right to step in. So where the public utility and a system operator or an independent power producer, which I shall call an IPP, fails to perform a material obligation, not just any obligation, a material obligation, or suspends or ceases operations in the electricity sector for any reason other than an event of force majeure, or the suspension or revocation of the license, the state shall have the right to step in and take over the performance or obligations of the operations. So in summary, Mr. President, at a very high level, electricity is a public good, and the state has a responsibility to ensure that it is protected. However, when Section 2 is looked at, it says the state may assign the right specified in subsection 1 to another person who is qualified to perform the obligation or continue the operation. But we did not want that to be the standalone section. So we included Section 3. The minister may include a license under such terms and conditions as may be appropriate for the purposes of subsections 1 and 2, but 4, the state shall not exercise the right to step in pursuant to subsection 1 or assign that right in subsection 2 without providing the licensee with an opportunity to make submissions as to why the state should not exercise or assign the right. It is very clear that the state can't just do what it likes. As a matter of fact, this legislation, for the first time, also unlike the ELPA, binds the state. It says so at the very beginning of the legislation. So we had a number of government buildings, a number of government agencies who were not bound by the previous legislation and who may have gone ahead without licensable activities because it did not bind the state. This one does. The state has to comply with the things that it is asking the market to comply with. Registration, that is covered as well. I don't want to spend too much time on that. Interconnection, this is important, Mr. President, because the interconnection regime is critical and it includes all of the agencies that I have spoken about: GEED, FTC, the Ministry of Course, and the public utility. Duties and participants in the electricity system. I want to spend 2 moments on this section here. Section 22 and Section 23, 22(3) and Section 23. Where the public utility shall not unreasonably refuse to enter into an agreement with a licensee or a registrant, but it also provides a mechanism for how we can arrive at a conclusion where you have a challenge. Where the public utility and the independent power producer fail to arrive at an agreement within the time frame established pursuant to subsection 2, the Commission, Fair Trading Commission, shall specify the terms and conditions of the agreement. And I want to give an example here, Mr. President. In systems over a certain size, you have power purchase agreements. These are typically negotiated between the independent power producer and the utility. The Fair Trading Commission provides a template, and then the final agreement has to be approved by the Commission. And we have not seen in recent years many of the PPAs signed and concluded. The ministry, along with the Fair Trading Commission and the utility, and again, with the very critical assistance of Sir David Simmons, have sat down and have looked at the provisions that have proven to be contentious in the power purchase agreement negotiations, along with our international partners, Mr. President, and we have tabled solutions. We went from having 8 areas outstanding to having 5 areas outstanding to having 1 area that is in the square and in the remit only of the power purchase producer and the utility. And I believe it is my understanding that during the course of the coming week, once this bill is behind us, hopefully, that the utility and the Sir David Simmons and the FTC will sit together to rationalize what that 1 remaining issue will look like. Mr. President, we have then duties of participants in the electrical system, so that is all covered, but I want to raise 1 particular element, Mr. President, beyond system operators. I can go through all of that. Mr. President, in 2019, Barbados had a blackout that the country talked about, laughed about, still talking about, still laughing about, because they call it the monkey blackout. Is that what they called it back then? Last year, we had another one. The existing legislation had no obligation for the utility to report to the minister. They did so out of relationship with a government, any government at that time they would speak to and let know what is happening, because the government has a responsibility for a public good, which is electricity. Mr. President, when the electricity went out on that blackout, and I've told this story before, when the electricity went out, I believe we were in cabinet. It was a Thursday afternoon, so I remember well. And I remember speaking to the utility and saying, what is the problem? What's happening? And they said to me, we expect the power to be back up potentially within the next 2 hours. But on the basis of past experience, instinctively, we knew that that was not likely to happen. It took them 7 hours to be able to get the system back up, Mr. President. And why did it take them 7 hours? One, it was a black start, so it required a significant deployment of effort and attention, and it was technical work that needed to be done. But more importantly, Mr. President, because of the high volume of intermittent renewable energy on the grid, it created instability on the grid. When the utility hit, and I was in, at the time I had left cabinet, electricity had come back in the area. We were at 72%, Mr. President. And I was in Massey in the line and the electricity went down, the generator kicked in. Utility was on the phone to say, Minister, we just lost all that we just restored. The system just went right back down. What was the challenge? That at that time of the evening, the clouds are starting to come over. The amount of RE that's coming in from solar panels on different people's roofs, probably many of you in here, is intermittent. And by the time it came back onto the grid, it created instability. And because they can't control it, they can't see it, they can't determine how it comes into the grid. It just comes onto the grid. That's the reason why there's a system operator. But there's also the reason, Mr. President, why there is a responsibility in this legislation when there is a major system failure that the system operator, the utility, has to inform the minister, now by law, and the commission on the status of the electricity system. At the time of those blackouts, they were legally required to notify the commission. There was no requirement to notify the ministry as the market monitor. This has now been inserted in the legislation. But Mr. President, it also says a couple of critical important things at section 3 of that section. The system operator shall conduct an investigation into the causes of a major system failure, utilizing an appropriate root cause analysis technique. This was in language inserted by actually the commission itself. We then have, Mr. President, they must submit to the minister, i.e. the market monitor, not the minister, the person, but the minister, the market monitor, and the commission, within 30 days of the system being restored to normal operating levels, a report on the matter, which shall include all the things above, its findings on the cause of the failure, an assessment of the costs associated with the failure, the measures taken to restore the system. But this is the part that I want to share. The measures to be taken to avoid a recurrence of the failure. And then 5, the measures taken to effectively communicate with the public regarding the failure and restoration of the system. We have incorporated the public all the way through in this legislation. We've also kept the threshold fairly low, Mr. President. Somebody may think, well, what's the definition for major system failure? Could it be that 100% goes down, 80%, 50%? We've kept it at 35%. If 35% of the cumulative installed capacity on the public grid goes down and it lasts for at least 2 hours, it is considered a major system failure. So, Mr. President, this is the section relating to the system operator. Where the public utilities, the system operator, it has some very specific requirements there, and it speaks to its responsibilities on dispatch, which must be kept separate from its other activities relating to generation, storage, transmission, distribution, and the sale of electricity. Mr. President, as I close, as I come to the latter part and try to close out my initial presentation, I did say I was going to try to be as exhaustive as I could on the bill. Under Part 6, Mr. President, of the legislation, and I'm not going to go through this, this section of the legislation covers the interrelationship between the Ministry of Public Works, Ministry of Transport and Works, and the Government Electrical and Engineering Department. This creates, Mr. President, these sections are lifted from the previous legislation at 2013, but they have been improved on, Mr. President, by expanding them substantially. So in summary, Mr. President, you can't just go and break out the People Road and just decide what you're going to do without reference to the Chief Technical Officer. So you see the reference to the Chief Technical Officer, a functionary, all the way through here. You see the reference, Mr. President, to the Chief Electrical Officer, all the way through the text as it relates to electricity, covered in this section of the legislation. The power to alter the positions of poles and wires and so on, that's not a matter in the public domain. You can't just do what you feel like. All of this is covered, Mr. President. Restriction on works above ground, restriction on the placement of electrical lines. Those are all matters which have to be dealt with and have to be approved by the appropriate technical entity, Mr. President. Mr. President, I then want to bring attention very quickly, if I can, to the section relating to codes, the grid code. I spoke about that earlier, so you have that there. A dispatch code is fairly important, especially, Mr. President, because this did not exist before, and the ministry now has a requirement for a dispatch policy and a dispatch code as well. So you have both the grid code, the dispatch code, and those shall be required under this legislation. Finally, Mr. President, well, almost finally, Part 8, Electricity System Benefit Fund. This is established under the legislation. The amount of work, and I asked my team last week to begin the process of aggregating the cost of the work that we have had done by agencies that have supported us. The Inter-American Development Bank, I have to recognize them publicly. The Rockefeller Fund, the Bezos Fund, the IKEA Fund through GIAP, I have to recognize them publicly. RELP, I have to recognize them publicly. RAP, I have to recognize them publicly, Mr. President, because if the volume of work that we have gotten out of all of those agencies were to be costed, my staff tells me we would be in the millions and the millions of dollars because they have worked with us in an extraordinary way. Mr. President, the team in the Ministry of Energy, with the support of these partners, can now tell you that we have in our possession a full grid characterization study. We have mapped the entire country, Mr. President. We can tell you where the clusters of solar exist, where the clusters on transmission lines, on distribution lines, where storage needs to be deployed, for what purpose. That work has been done with the support of these partners and through the exchange of ready information under non-disclosure agreement from the utility. They're not things that you can just necessarily, there are people, last week or so, someone came and they said, oh, we want to do a project in Barbados, and we went to the utility and they were asking the utility some questions, and what they got from the utility they were not satisfied with. I said, but you're not under non-disclosure agreement. Why would they share their proprietary information with someone who's just walking off the road? It don't work so. So they didn't. But I can tell you that the Ministry of Energy, with the non-disclosure agreements in place and with all of the international partners and all the development partners, has been able to have full access to the information relating to the grid and relating to our energy system overall. And in so doing, system planning has taken place at a level that has been expansive. I also want to express my support, Mr. President, my appreciation for the Fair Trading Commission, in whose affairs we do not interfere, because they are quasi-judicial bodies, so you will never hear me from here or any other pulpit speaking about matters under the remit of the Fair Trading Commission. That's not for me as a minister to do. But what I can say to you, Mr. President, is that on matters relating to policy, the Fair Trading Commission, on all of the things that I have just described, has sat at every single table, on every single meeting, with every single partner, each and every single time. And they don't have a large team, but they have come to the table in the interest of policy coherence. The decommissioning fund I mentioned earlier, Mr. President, when I spoke about the Ministry of Environment and Environmental Protection, this decommissioning and the decommissioning fund is related to the importance of the circular economy and protecting the environment and ensuring that when you reach the end of life, and the electrical, I'm going to tie this into the electrical inspectors which are in the legislation, when you reach the end of life of your system. Mr. President, yesterday on the back page of the newspaper, we saw someone lamenting people dumping indiscriminately in our gullies. The idea here, Mr. President, is that we don't want to see energy installations, energy infrastructure finding their way in places that they don't belong. And so investors have to incorporate in their financial modeling what is necessary for them when their infrastructure reaches the end of their life cycle, where they will go. where they will put them and how they will dispose of them or how they will repurpose them. That is the requirement for a decommissioning fund, because you're meant to have the financing planned for so you can execute it, and then you are required to submit a decommissioning plan as well. The electrical inspectors are part of this process, Mr. President, because we want to ensure, and funny enough, when Beryl passed through, I remember seeing photos of the energy teams sent me photos of Beryl, and if you recall, the Barbados Light and Power sent teams down to the affected islands, and they then shared photos. That team, working with our team as well, shared some interesting information. They shared with us photos of ground-mounted solar systems that stood up against Beryl and those that did not. And one of the conversations that evolved was what is necessary for resilience, what is necessary for structural integrity. When you're going to put up a solar system or a ground-mounted system, you just look back at it, you just know that it's producing what it's supposed to produce, and if it goes down, you want to understand why. But the requirement for us to maintain installations at a certain standard is introduced in this legislation, one, and it is meant to be enforced in this legislation through the appointment of electrical inspectors who are responsible now for the first time for going out there and seeing and reviewing where installations are for renewable energy and ensuring that they are compliant with standards that are to be developed. These are also meant to be captured, Mr. President, under the regulations, and there's also the provision, Mr. President, for the reporting and how those things are meant to be costed. Finally, Mr. President, Part 11, the Electricity Appeals Tribunal, I've spoken about that before, the opportunity for us to have appellate mechanisms included. If you appeal to the tribunal and you're still not happy, then you have the recourse of appealing to the High Court. I've spoken about I have not spoken about the Renewable Energy Procurement Committee, Mr. President. The Renewable Energy Procurement Committee is, again, this is going to be covered in the regs as well, and it is anticipated that the Renewable Energy Procurement Committee is going to be populated by the Chief Procurement Officer, the Fair Trading Commission, the GEED, the Chief Technical Officer, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Energy and Business, and any other persons who are not conflicted in any way, but the agencies that have regulatory authority for the energy sector, the electricity sector, and for government procurement are expected to be under this section in this committee as captured in regulations. And so, Mr. President, I have gone through the bill in this great detail deliberately, because a lot of times when we introduce bills, we speak about the policy framing. But I wanted on this occasion, because this is a substantive bill, to go through the bill itself. At Section 72, for example, it speaks about planning and development permission, planning and development plan. We have a planning and development plan. We have a development plan for the country. And we want to make sure that what we do is in coherence with that. This bill is a coherence bill. It is a policy-driven bill. It assigns to the regulator the role of the regulator, because they already have those roles assigned in the Fair Trading Commission Act and in the Utilities Regulation Act. That's their responsibility. That's where the interveners exist. There's no mechanism. There never has been a mechanism in our legislation for there to be anything called an intervener before the ministry as a market monitor. It has never existed in law, Mr. President. That's not there. But it has existed, Mr. President, before the Fair Trading Commission. The Planning and the Development Department, which is responsible for Section 72, there's also a public process. If you want to change the use, Mr. President, of a piece of land, you have to put up a sign. You have to have a public consultation in the area. People who live in the area or whoever has an interest, they are invited to come and submit. Those processes have been embedded in this legislation and they have been reaffirmed. There has been no attempt, either in spirit or in action, to remove the process of public consultation even slightly. They remain vested in law, Mr. President. And so the opportunity will come, I am sure, for me to speak about matters relating to policy. When I close up this bill, I have chosen to use my time to go over the bill itself and to make it clear. There are a range of things happening in the energy sector. There are on the policy side. This bill is not meant to be a catch-all for everything on the policy side. The policies will be spoken about at such time as may be appropriate and in a different context, but this bill speaks about regulatory management as it relates to the role of the market monitor and how the market monitor interfaces with the public, how it interfaces with the other agencies that have legal authority over the electricity sector, and then how these things then empower Barbadians as the new independent producers to come into the space and have access to what has been a lucrative and potentially transformational sector that is the sector of our future, Mr. President. And with these few words, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Senator Walters.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning to my fellow senators. Let me first join the President and the leader of government business in welcoming my comrade, Senator Andrew Worrell, to the chamber. I look forward to working with him on behalf of not only the party's interests, but the people of Barbados. Mr. President, this bill, as Senator Cummins has alluded to, is a very technical bill and deals with different specifics as relates to